And so they're vigorously trying to block social media, news of what is going on in Hong Kong so that mainland Chinese people don't hear about it and don't see it and perhaps don't get any ideas from it. And I think that is the real story of this.
That interview is coming up in just a moment. You're listening to Asia News Weekly, a digest from the Asia Pacific region. What are the financial implications of the Hong Kong protests? Will the UN refer North Korea to the International Criminal Court? The WHO tells Asia to get ready for Ebola. These stories and more are on the October 17th edition of Asia News Weekly. Welcome to the podcast, everyone. I'm your host, Steve Miller. I'd like to begin by thanking you for listening and downloading this week's show. The story from Hong Kong remains fluid as police continue to forcibly remove protesters from where they've been entrenched. Rather than recap the events from earlier this week, in this episode, I'd like to spend our time by focusing on the future. To begin that discussion, I'm inviting back to the program Curtis S. Chin. He's the inaugural Asia Fellow with the Milken Institute. Curtis, welcome back to the program.
Thank you. It's always great to be on the podcast.
Okay, Curtis. Hong Kong is a business center. Have the protests affected its bottom line?
So far it's been mixed. Clearly, there's been a short-term impact on tourism, on real estate. The stock market there has also fluctuated. But I think in long term, people are factoring into their views of the Hong Kong economy what this will mean in terms of real long-term business consequences. I remember, I was based in New York at that time, but I was representing the Hong Kong government in their response to SARS. I worked closely with their economic and trade offices. And then, like now, tremendous, impact from, really a big, what proved to be a short-term disruption then. Retail, real estate, tourism were impacted by SARS way back then. Clearly, some of those same sectors are being impacted now. But, unlike SARS, this is also about a longer-term view of Hong Kong, both by China and the rest of the world. And, the verdict's still out on how to play out, but I think the message is clear, as a Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson said. Let's not forget that Hong Kong is China's Hong Kong. And so as I think about, as an American, I have great empathy, great sympathy for what some of the protesters are trying to accomplish, a more democratic, a freer Hong Kong. But also we have to deal with the reality that Hong Kong is indeed a part of China. And so that's what we're seeing right now. Also, I think what we're seeing right now is a growing split. Cynics might say, the mainland Chinese, the Communist Party, have an upper hand in a strategy of first wait and divide and then conquer. Because I think right now you're also seeing, it goes to your very important business question, Hong Kong's all about business, is that we're now seeing the regular person, the taxi driver, the retailer whose store might be blocked by a protest. We're beginning to see some of them speak up, that they need to also get on with their lives and make a bit of money to feed their families, even when they themselves might also be hoping one day for what many of the protesters are hoping for, which is that Hong Kong will be better able and more free to pick who will lead Hong Kong into the future.
There's been some use of force to clear out protesters from key areas. How could a harsh crackdown affect Hong Kong's business sector?
I don't know. I think when there is an unfortunate accident or, a bigger problem breaks out, business will, of course, have already tried to mitigate its risk by diversifying, by planning ahead for, in those cases, in terms of what might happen. So I think in terms of Hong Kong, businesses have already seen what is happening. They've already made their plans with regards to the day-to-day. Do workers have to go to the office, or could they work at home? But if you think back, again, 50 years is a blink of an eye. And so some in mainland China might say, 1989, that was also a blink of an eye ago. But clearly, after 1989, American particularly, but Western businesses in general, pulled out of China. But look at it now. Everyone wants to be back. And we're actually in this great cycle of things, also seeing now the Chinese also, I feel, being a little bit more assertive, aggressive, some would say, not just in terms of land and territorial disputes, but also how they treat foreign businesses out there. I remember just in the last couple of weeks, I wrote a piece about comparing corruption in the United States and corruption in China. Both places, every place in the world has some kind of corruption. When you look at Transparency International, which is a group out of Berlin, but they do a ranking of most countries in the world with regards to perceptions of corruption. I think the U.S. is generally only among the 20 least corrupt out of, let's say, 160, 70 nations. China is always way down there. But it isn't to say there isn't corruption in each place. And so business and others have to deal with these issues. They have to deal with risks, but certainly the risks are much higher in a place like China, where it continues to be less about rule of law and more about rule by individuals. I think what the Hong Kong people are saying is, Hong Kong people, I think, I'm not from Hong Kong, from the US, but I think Hong Kong people are proud, as the world should be, about China's success in lifting hundreds of millions out of poverty. But there's a lot that goes on in China that I don't think even if the mainland Chinese people, if they could speak freely, and they're not able to, are so proud of, in terms of human rights violations, in terms of that difficult balance of, the individual versus greater community. And so, Hong Kong, of course, would like to chart its own way forward. But again, the reality, as we began this podcast, the reality is that Hong Kong is part of China. My great hope would be that there is what I'd say call a face-saving way out, but it's difficult to see a face-saving way out if it means that the mainland China authorities will look weaker. I think at the end of the day, this story is less about Hong Kong. It's about the mainland Chinese authorities and their own worries about unrest in mainland China. And so they're vigorously trying to block social media, news of what is going on in Hong Kong, so that mainland Chinese people don't hear about it and don't see it, and perhaps don't get any ideas from it. And I think that is the real story of this. So Hong Kong people, unfortunately, will have to deal with the consequences of the mainland authorities, first and foremost worrying about what's going on in the mainland. And if it means, squashing what's going on in Hong Kong, that will be what is done. But again, my hope is that there is a face-saving way out, in that, universal suffrage, if you read this document, again, the Basic Law document, it really isn't defined. And so some will say that what the mainland Chinese are doing is perfectly in accordance with the Basic Law. And so it goes down to intent. What was the intent of the original document? And remember, that original document was negotiated between the British, the then colonial masters, and the mainland Chinese. It wasn't the Hong Kong people. It was these two sovereign nations deciding the future of Hong Kong. So sadly, we're back at that same situation where another entity is deciding the future of the Hong Kong people. But as an American, as a proud American, as a pro-business person, pro-free markets person, I know in my heart, and I hope the Chinese know in their heart, that in the long run, their success in making better lives for their own people, including the people of Hong Kong, will be over time allowing free markets, free speech to develop. But in the near term, I think we'll see difficult times ahead. We'll see bumps on the road, both in Hong Kong and in China. But don't count China out. Don't count Hong Kong out. I think there's investment opportunities to be made, even in the worst of times.
All right, Curtis, thank you very much.
Great. It's always good to be on Asia News Weekly on your podcast, and look forward to sharing thoughts on another occasion also. Thank you again.
With everything that's happened over the past several weeks, one can't help but to look at Macau and Taiwan and wonder what's in store for them and their relationship with the mainland. President Ma Ying-jeou of Taiwan said last week that he gave his strong support for the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong and urged Beijing to fulfill its promise. China should allow the people of Hong Kong to enjoy the first taste of democracy, in the same way the late leader Deng Xiaoping allowed some of the Chinese to get rich first, Ma said in his National Day address. Ma also said Beijing had an opportunity to turn the crisis around and create a win-win situation for both the mainland and Hong Kong, which in turn would serve to enhance relations between Taiwan and China. Ma even cited the 1992 consensus, which has been the basis for improving relations between Beijing and Taiwan for the past 6 years. Some have postulated that whatever happens in Hong Kong, Taiwan might be next, hence Ma's vocal support for the pro-democracy movement. Charles Chen says that's like comparing apples and oranges. He notes the Republic of China, or Taiwan, has never been governed by the Chinese Communist Party. Taiwanese people elect their president and national legislature. They serve in their military forces and have the full power of interpretation over their constitution. It's something Hong Kong doesn't possess. Hong Kong is bound by the one country, two systems scheme, and Taiwan never accepted that, which is why Ma vehemently rejected that notion when she proposed it recently. Furthermore, Taiwan is a full democracy and has demonstrated as much over the past 14 years. Beijing may want to control Taipei and bring it into the fold of one China, but it lacks the ability to do so without force, and realistically wouldn't be able to employ such a move without dire international consequences. While many are looking to see if Taiwan is next in Beijing's sights, the truth of the matter is, it isn't anything more than a dream for President Xi. Beijing has Hong Kong firmly in its grasp, both in terms of politics and with the military. So the question then turns to Macau and its fledgling democracy movement. Macau's people first showed signs of a political awakening of its own in May of this year. The political influence of Hong Kong is also apparent. The city's ongoing political unrest seems to have emboldened many Macau residents to take up the mantle for universal suffrage. After Macau's chief executive was re-elected in a one-man race on a pro-Beijing ticket, 89% of residents cast a vote of no confidence, and 95% said they would prefer their leadership to be chosen through direct elections. The parallel is clear. Whatever happens in Hong Kong will be repeated in Macau if they choose to follow the same path. So, where do we go from here? We've seen a much more concerted effort by Hong Kong authorities to clear the streets this week, using batons, pepper spray, and other means at their disposal, sometimes creating situations which have turned violent. Some analysts have said they feel the central government wants to wrap things up before Monday morning on the 20th, and that certainly appears to be the case. With that date looming only a few days away, all eyes will be on the streets of Hong Kong this weekend to see what happens now. For the latest from Hong Kong, be sure to follow our Twitter feed and subscribe to the Asia Brief podcast for daily updates. But I want to know, what's your opinion of what's transpiring in Hong Kong? Please share your thoughts in the comments on Facebook and Twitter. Ebola and Asia. What you need to know is coming up in just a few minutes. On Tuesday, weeks of speculation ended when North Korean leader Kim Jong-un resurfaced. The young leader's appearance surprised many, since it was rumored that he needed an additional 60 days to recover from his surgery. However, as noted on this program, that Kim was still around shouldn't have come to anyone's surprise. As analysts repeatedly stated, there were no signs of a coup. So why did Kim choose to return now? Well, that also is a great source of speculation, much like his disappearance. Now, one reason might just be the United Nations. A draft resolution is moving forward to the General Assembly, recommending that the UN refer North Korea to the International Criminal Court in The Hague for human rights abuses and crimes against humanity. Diplomats feel that this could put extra pressure on the DPRK and place China in an uncomfortable position. The draft resolution, which was prepared by the European Union and Japan, says the General Assembly encourages the Security Council to consider referral of the situation in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea to the International Criminal Court. So what happens now? Well, there are just a few things to keep in mind. First, North Korea is not a member of the International Criminal Court. Second, resolutions passed in the General Assembly are non-binding. Third, Security Council resolutions are binding, and they are enforceable through sanctions and military action. And finally, China, as a member of the Security Council, will most likely exercise its veto ability. South Korea, for its part, said it will likely raise the issue of North Korea's human rights abuses during the UN's Third Committee meeting later this month. As a whole, the United Nations issues a number of resolutions each year condemning human rights violations, often including Iran, Myanmar, and Syria with North Korea. But this is the first measure to include a written recommendation for referral to the International Criminal Court. Unfortunately, without approval from the Security Council, the measure will die in committee. How China responds to the measure bears watching. If it issues a veto, as is expected, it sends a strong signal to the rest of the global community that it hasn't abandoned the Kim regime and will still serve as some sort of protector for the nation. Should that ever change, it'll be a whole new ballgame. What do you think China will do with this measure? Will it issue a veto, or let the measure slide through so it can focus more on domestic issues? Be sure and let us know. If you would like to know more about this or any of the other stories mentioned in this week's podcast, take a look at the show notes. They're available at asiannewsweekly.net. World Health Organization Chief Margaret Chan on Monday urged Asia-Pacific countries to strengthen their defenses against Ebola. While there haven't been any signs of Ebola yet in Asia, the region is no stranger to deadly outbreaks. In urging Asia to prepare, Chan said, quote, "In the simplest terms, this outbreak shows how one of the deadliest pathogens on Earth can exploit any weakness in the health infrastructure. You cannot build these systems up during a crisis. Instead, they collapse. A dysfunctional health system means zero population resilience to the range of shocks that our world is delivering, with an ever greater frequency and force." End quote. In short, Chan says, failing to prepare could put the world at risk. So why is Chan warning Asia? Well, American experts warn that the lethal Ebola virus could reach China in 3 weeks, and from there, spread to Hong Kong and Macau. Cross-referencing data between airline routes around the world and Ebola's route of transmission, the virus could spread to Hong Kong and Macau quickly from China, and the thousands of airliners entering and exiting the areas if the two did not adopt any preventative measures. It should be noted that this speculation and the warning it's based on are using theoretical models. Health ministers from East Asia are meeting this week for the 65th session of the World Health Organization's Regional Committee for the Western Pacific in Manila. The body's regional executive, Shin Young-soo, said the ministers and experts would discuss ways to deploy and share resources to prevent an Ebola outbreak in the region. They will also look at ways to contain the virus if an outbreak does occur in East Asia. When asked if an Ebola outbreak is inevitable in Asia, Shin said, quote, "It is possible because our region, Asia-Oceania, has some of the most advanced countries and is a global transportation hub. There is a lot of trade and communication. It is very, very difficult for us to monitor our citizens' travels. There are major areas or gaps where indeed a passenger exposed to the virus may reach us." End quote. While this is a very deadly disease, it's also important to keep in mind what our very capable health professionals can do. SARS, swine flu, and a number of other diseases were poised to become either epidemics or even worse, pandemics. By remaining calm and allowing governments and health organizations to effectively do their jobs, catastrophe can be averted. New research into vaccines may also prove to be a cure for the deadly Ebola virus. The best thing you can do is educate yourself about the disease and how it spread. Keep in mind, the Ebola virus can only be transmitted through the bodily fluids of people who have it and are seriously ill. Most likely these individuals will be vomiting, bleeding, or have diarrhea. Blood, feces, and vomit are the most infectious types of fluids, and in the later stages of the disease, even a tiny amount of them can carry a high yield of the Ebola virus. And if you get blood on your hands, just washing it off with soap is good enough. One's only in danger if they have a cut or a break in the skin that would allow the virus to enter your body, or if it would go through a mucous membrane, say like rubbing your eyes or if you put your hands in your mouth. As dangerous as the Ebola virus is, at this point, there's just no need to panic. What else is happening in the Asia-Pacific region? Well, coming up, the weekly brief with stories you may have missed. I began using the internet in 1994. I remember hooking up phone lines to computers and being absolutely thrilled when I could play against my friends by dialing into their computers to play Doom 2. Anyone else out there remember that BFG? Today, some 67 million users connect to a centralized server to play League of Legends, or LOL as it's often referred to. This upcoming Saturday marks the finals of the World Championships of one of the most popular esport games today. The event is being held in a soccer stadium constructed for the 2002 World Cup in Seoul, South Korea. The top prize this year, aside from bragging rights and a 70-pound trophy dubbed the Summoners Cup, is a cool $1 million. Yeah, the game is that popular. If you're not familiar with League of Legends, let me break it down for you. Essentially, teams are made up of 5 individuals who try to obtain the opposing team's nexus. Think of it as a variant of capture the flag. Each player also has unique attributes, special abilities, making for a very unique type of gameplay that changes based on which teams you are playing. One of the teams going for this year's top prize won't even have to fly very far. They're the Samsung White. It's a South Korean team sponsored, of course, by the local tech giant. The other team playing in the event, and the first one ever to make back-to-back appearances, is from China and goes by the name Starhorn Royal Club. They finished second last year, earning a not-too-shabby $250,000 prize. While this team is from China, not all of their players are. 2 of their members are South Koreans. To get to the finals, these teams had to survive previous rounds from regional games, then best a group stage, and finally a knockout round. Odds makers are given the win to the Samsung White, which boasts a very impressive 12-1 record. But as we all know with major sporting championships, anything can happen. What I'd like to know is, are you a LOL fan? Do you play League of Legends? Let me know in the comments. And if you're not, what games do you like to play? By the way, don't miss our other podcast, Asia Now. It's released every Wednesday and features stories and interviews from the Asia-Pacific region. This week on the show, what's behind the defamation charge against a Japanese reporter in South Korea? What else has happened this week that you might have missed? Well, let's take a look with the weekly brief. Indonesian and Australian scientists confirmed cave art found on the island of Sulawesi in Indonesia is approximately 40,000 years old. This pushes back the date of man's oldest art by thousands of years. Scientists found the cave paintings about 60 years ago, but thought they were much younger, believing the Southeast Asian climate would have destroyed older works. It's a truly remarkable find, and will hopefully allow archaeologists to better understand our past. According to the journal Nature, the Indonesian discovery could prompt a, quote, gold rush to find even older art on the route of human migration from Africa to the East. From Indonesia, we turn to Lumbee, British Columbia, Canada. A forestry crew might have uncovered a World War II Japanese balloon bomb in the Monashi Mountains, about 460 kilometers outside of Vancouver. In the final years of the war, the Imperial Japanese Army released more than 9,000 bomb-bearing balloons to drift in the jet stream towards Canada and the United States. At least 1,000 made it to North America, and 1 detonated in Oregon, about 70 years ago, killing 6. Last week, those investigating Flight MH17 released information indicating passengers may have known the plane was going down. The body of one passenger was found wearing an oxygen mask, indicating there was sufficient time for the emergency device to be deployed and applied. No other passengers recovered thus far have been found in such condition. The South Korean Coast Guard last week fatally shot the captain of a Chinese fishing vessel who resisted inspection of his ship for suspected illegal fishing in South Korea's Western Exclusive Economic Zone. China's foreign ministry urged South Korea to investigate the incident and punish those responsible for the captain's death. Quote, "We are appalled by the violence used by South Korea during law enforcement, which led to the death of one Chinese captain," said spokesman Hong Lei. According to reports, a dozen South Korean Coast Guard officers boarded the Chinese ship. The Chinese captain then began resisting violently as 4 other Chinese fishing vessels approached and sent their crew aboard, said South Korea's Cho Nam-young. The Chinese fishermen used knives and beer bottles to assault the South Koreans, according to the Coast Guard statement, and 5 South Korean officers received minor injuries. One of the South Korean officers then fired 8 shots after 3 blanks, but didn't specifically aim at the captain. South Korea's foreign ministry informed the Chinese embassy in Seoul of the incident and expressed regret over the captain's death. And finally, it appears Japan will have casino gambling after all, but not for the locals. Only foreign nationals will initially be allowed to gamble at casinos after their ban is lifted, according to revisions to a bill being considered by the Diet. It's hoped that the inclusion of casinos will help boost Japan's sagging tourism industry. However, as one of Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's aides correctly mentioned, with only foreigners gambling, casinos will not be profitable. The momentum for promoting integrated resorts may lose steam. A ban on locals gambling in South Korea, save for one casino, hasn't been an effective source of revenue, and the question remains, why make Tokyo a gambling destination when Macau is relatively close? Well, those are all the stories for this week's episode, but before I go, let's take a quick gander at what you had to say in the comments last time. First up, J-Hep Beng commented on our Asia Now podcast about competitiveness and Korean education. It was a fairly lengthy comment, and it read in part, "I must leave a comment to show the thoughts of an actual Korean student about the Korean education system. I hated it so much. I believe that this model creates 2 problems. First, adults who are in this system do not think about raising their voices against upper classes or higher officials. Therefore, social problems are not corrected, and those same problems keep coming up as a result. The recent Sewol accident was because of it. Second, it is purely against democracy. However, the Korean model is not. Students who are in this system cannot think about social and political problems in the society because of astonishingly heavy burdens on their shoulders, making the students slaves." J-Hep's comments were echoed by many, both before the interview with the researchers and since. And I will admit, I do agree with many of their comments that the social implications of the Korean educational system need to be addressed. The high stress, the low productivity, and high suicide rates are a significant societal problem. And while global competitiveness and test scores are high, the ends don't necessarily justify the means. In fact, Kevin O'Shea, the host of the Just Japan podcast, echoed the thoughts of many expats who, when planning the future of their children, tend to say this: "I prefer the Western educational system. I live in Japan now, but my wife and I plan for our children to be schooled in Canada." And finally, many comments trickled in throughout the week about our ongoing coverage from Hong Kong. It's something I really do appreciate, so thank you for those kind remarks. And speaking of remarks, I want to thank you for all the comments that were left last week. I really, truly do value them, and I hope you'll take a moment to share your thoughts about the stories I covered in this week's podcast. I hope you'll do so either in the comments, on Facebook, or on Twitter. Now, if you haven't found us on social media, those addresses are as follows. You can go to facebook.com/AsiaNewsWeekly for our Facebook page, or tweet to us at AsiaNewsWeekly on Twitter. You can also send an email to the show with your questions or feedback. You can even send us your comments about these stories or attach an audio file. Just drop a line to asiannewsweekly@gmail.com. You can also play and download all of our episodes at our website, which is asiannewsweekly.net. But if you prefer the show in podcast form, look for us on iTunes, Stitcher, and TuneIn Radio. And if you really enjoyed this episode, please share it with your friends and subscribe to the podcast so you won't miss the next one. For more news, check out the Asia Brief podcast. It's released every Monday through Thursday morning with the region's key stories to keep an eye on. One more piece of information, I will be on vacation next week, so there won't be an Asia News Weekly podcast until October 31st. Well, my friends, that is the podcast for this week. Once more, I'd like to thank you for listening. For Asia News Weekly, I'm Steve Miller. Asia News Weekly is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 international license.